One of the things that I talk about in my class, an ethics class, is how do you develop an ethical framework? How do you decide what is right and wrong? So one of the aspects we're going to talk about today is really how do people who believe in naturalism, how do they decide what is right and wrong?
Well, as a scientist, let me jump in on the naturalism piece. By naturalism, of course, the idea behind that is natural, and the idea is that we are purely made out of matter. There's nothing else to us. All the rest of it are perceptions that really have a material root. And
which means there's no mind, there's no soul. Is that
right.
What you're saying?
That's right. Yeah,
okay.
Those are all illusions,
Yeah,
including
no ghost in the
consciousness,
machine.
which they would try and explain away.
Okay.
So that's very unsatisfying. But they would run the tape as far as an evolutionary progression of some primordial early form of life that now culminates in humans. So a natural question would then be whether or not the discussion we're having based on our rational brains is even credible from an evolutionary perspective.
Right. Is the impulse to find right and wrong, where are we even?
Yeah, where is that coming from? And C.S. Lewis kind of nailed the point when he said something to the effect of, if my brain is the process of an evolutionary process, why should I trust its conclusions? Mm-hmm. And yet we do.
Right. So how can the naturalist then say, I don't trust your conclusions are wrong? How can a person...
What's the basis of rejecting
Yes.
those conclusions?
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
And
So
what's-
there's an
what's-
assumption that there's some
Right.
kind of rationality that
Right.
underlies all of us that we're all responsible to.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so what happens sometimes as we cover various people and themes of Western thought is we talk about people who have these worldviews. One of the major ones is naturalism, but they keep having these impulses that just don't fit within their framework. And so we explore a number of ways to critique their sets of ideas, one of which is it internally consistent? That is, does the whole thing hold together? Another is, does it describe the real world that we live in? A lot of people who say that there's no right and wrong, they're very, very moralistic when it comes to everybody else. They condemn wars, they condemn slavery, and they condemn racism, and things that we ought to condemn, but the framework that they want to use to condemn those things is very difficult to get from strict naturalism.
Even as they're objecting to the idea that there's right or wrong, they're saying it's wrong to
Yes.
believe in right and wrong.
Yeah.
And not even realizing how contradictory that simple statement is.
There are no right moral ethical statements except the last one I just made.
Right, yes. So what chapter, Jessica, maybe you would cover this in a class, what chapter of Scripture comes to our mind when we think about this, about people suppressing or holding down the truth?
One of the passages that I think of is Romans 1:18. It's talking about that God has shown us truths in the Bible, truths in creation, but there are those who have suppressed the truth. And so in that case, it comes down to the aspect of people are worshiping the creatures instead of the creator. So we get to the aspect of more of humanism, naturalism, materialism, instead of worshiping God.
Yeah, and so the way I put it in Essential Science is that there is this conflict, there's this built-in noise, dissonance within the naturalistic perspective, because I'm supposed to just be an evolved animal. So there ought to be some close similarity to the animal world, and yet that's not what we feel like as humans. We have to keep explaining away the fact that we're having discussions about ultimate questions, about ethics, about things that we think have a rational conclusion. So the humanist is really alternating between two perspectives. One is, am I a little g God? Am I the closest there is on this planet to a God? Or am I a big A animal? And so they're willing, I think the animal rights movement plays into this, the unwillingness to acknowledge my position as one created in the image of God.
Right.
Where there is emphatic distance between me and the animal world, and to say instead, let's close the gap. And one of the most outrageous ways the gap is attempting to be closed these days is to confer personhood on animals like dolphins,
Right.
for instance, that they're persons too.
Right. So we're asking the question, does a dolphin as it's swimming around think, what would it be like to maybe be the captain of a boat? Or what would it be like to fly as a bird? Are those ideas or thoughts that a dolphin would have? And of course, it's absurd,
Right.
because a dolphin's not made in the image of God. That's certainly a clear divide, those that are made in God's image, and animals and plants, which are not.
A lot of these thoughts come out in ways of how students think about some of these issues, how they decide what is right and wrong, or even in how they are going to interact with people in the future. So as something like medical ethics, it's important to understand where they're coming from, where everybody else is coming from, because they will understand how they're going to make decisions. So you can't tell somebody that their thinking is wrong if they don't actually even believe in right or wrong in the first place. So a lot of these aspects will have an impact on how students, how people in the future will make decisions, as well as how they can almost combat them or respond to their answers that they've given.
Sure, and what we believe is going to, right, as Christians, impact how we treat the naturalist. Because if I'm consistent with the biblical worldview, I look at a person who denies God, I look at an atheist, I look at somebody who is anti-Christian, and I still give him complete respect, and I show him the love of Christ, because even though he's not willing to admit it, he's made in the image of my God.
Absolutely.
And that is why I still will be gracious and kind to him, regardless of the fact that he rejects my Christ.
Which is moral and right.
Absolutely. Amen.
Yes.